formally will start the conference at 10:20. But in order to welcome the Foreign Minister Tziporah Livni, we are preponing her lecture, so I would like to call upon Tziporah Livni to deliver her opening address today on the historical rights and the legal rights of the State of Israel. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dory. Thank you all. And it seems to me that in order to understand what the problems are that we're facing, we need to talk about the legitimate rights of the State of Israel and to add of the State of Israel as a national home to the Jewish people, because it seems to me if there are problems that we are facing today, it is not only the ones that deal with the existence of the State of Israel or the existence of the State of Israel as part of the international community, but also the right or its right to exist as a national home for the Jewish people. It stands to reason even before the founding of the state, before it was accepted to the UN, that the Zionist movement and the international legitimacy that was given, if we're talking about the Balfour Declaration, they talked about national rights in the through a sovereign manifestation. The same was true in 1947 when the UN tries to find a solution to the Israeli-Arab conflict. The resolution talks about a solution by setting up two national states, one of which would be the Jewish state and another one would be the Arab state. And it seems what was taken for granted that the Jewish people would have a right for self-determination in its own country. The place is the land of Israel, the historic place of the State of Israel, where it has historic and national rights. And it was only natural to have a Jewish state in Eretz Israel. And we, in our Bill of Independence, we reinforced it. And since then, once those self-evident things were stated and voted on, what was taken for granted then is not taken for granted now. And if we're talking about the challenges we have to cope with, this is the most significant challenge to my mind of the State of Israel in the short run. First of all, we need to tell ourselves as a society what we are, because this is something that we need to convey outside or relay outside. So we should, as an Israeli society, should have the same ultimate goal that is shared by everybody, which is the existence of the State of Israel as a national home for the Jewish people and a democratic state whereby those values of Judaism and democracy are intertwined, do not clash with other, one that lives in security peacefully with its neighbors in the land of Israel. I'm reiterating this self-evident truth for us, because there are processes that we need to preserve within our house, within our home, in Israeli society, that will maintain the values of the State of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. But this also impacts on our struggle outwardly. And we also need to be sincere and be truthful to say what's going on outside. If things are not said out loud, there is an undercurrent process which negates the legitimacy of the State of Israel as a national home, and unless we say it out loudly, we won't be able to cope with it. And this is done partly in discussions when those are abstract, theoretical, in university discussions. What is a national state? Is Israel whose right to exist in security? By the way, nobody disagrees with that. Or perhaps the national identity is part of the values that should have international protection also from the state standpoint of the State of Israel. Perhaps this is lack of knowledge. Perhaps this is an interviewer that at the end of the interview asks me, what is a Jewish state? To be a Jew is a religion. Where do you introduce this national aspect, and what's the relation between the State of Israel and that? Because you can be a Jew anywhere around the world. So we are undergoing processes whereby, if we talk about in terms of Europe, where boundaries are open up, and we see the blurring of delicate things because this is due to innovation and this impacts the attitude towards Israel. And I would like to take one very simple example so that we can tell ourselves the truth. When the Hamas government rose to power and when the quartet set the conditions which every government, every Palestinian government should uphold and demanded recognition of the right of the state of Israel to exist, I'm going to put this on as a question mark, but I'm going to ask myself, are those words that we would add to this sentence, recognition of the state of Israel to exist as a Jewish state, would the world be willing to add those two words to demand from any Palestinian government? I'm not putting this as a question mark, but this is partly part of the things that we need to cope with, because to my mind, beyond the need to fight over the physical existence of the state of Israel and the need to fight over the values of the state of Israel as a democratic state, truly the only democracy in the Middle East, our existence as a national home for the Jewish people is the ultimate goal, not only that justify the establishment of the state of Israel, but also compels us. This is our main goal as a society and certainly as a government. So the state of Israel, the government of Israel, finds itself as a partner to various struggles. And sometimes it is to reinforce the legitimacy of the state of Israel as a democratic Jewish state, and partly to fight together with the Jewish world to fight anti-Semitism that links up. There's a mixture between an illegitimate criticism against Israel, what seems on the one hand, what we saw in Durban 1 and in Durban 2, and the struggle with the free world of which we're a part to fight over common values for us and the free world. And part of the problem is that even though it is clear to everyone in the state of Israel, I'm not even talking about the government, what are those values? Namely, that we share the values of the free world. We found ourselves in a situation where there's an immense gap, intolerable, a gap that is conducive to illegitimacy between the state of Israel, between what it is, its values, and the image of the state of Israel outside its boundaries. So we find ourselves in a situation where, to my mind, is something that we need to deal with, and I'm willing to be judged by the international community on every aspect, but I want this judgment of the international community would be legitimacy based on the values of that community. And just as every judicial system is based on values of society and draws a distinction between a premeditated killing and inadvertent killing in an accident, and even though the sorrow of the victims is the same sorrow, but this moral distinction is very important. And therefore I would expect the international community, when there are Israeli casualties from terrorists that are deliberately murdered, against cases in which we are forced in order to defend our citizens against terrorism, as a result there's collateral casualties, I would expect the international community not to bundle it up altogether. To commiserate is very nice, but the international community should draw a distinction, because this really pertains to values. And when we take restrictions upon ourselves, not because of international law, but also because of our own values, I would like the free world of which we are part and with whose values we share, because we chose to be that way, would judge us by the same standards and by the same yardstick. And so we can see a situation where we also need to cope with, where there's an understanding, an international understanding. I understand that by the division of the conflicts, there are less territorial ones, there are less national conflicts, and I will talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a second. And it's more religious-based conflicts, and understanding that the religious struggle is not fighting for rights for somebody, but this is an illegitimate struggle in order to negate the others' their rights. And in this respect, Israel is at the forefront But the reason, the arguments for extremism is not Israel. It is not the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or Israeli-Arab conflict, but we are paying the price of the unwillingness of the extremists to get our own legitimate right to exist, but not only as a state, but also as a country that has a self-determination of a peoplehood. And therefore, anybody who argues or anybody who thinks that if we are able to end the conflict here, there will be peace in the Middle East and around the world, and I'm saying this to avert any doubt. Israel has a vested interest in ending the conflict. Time is not in our favor. We will do everything in order to allow ourselves to live in peace, and I will talk about the parameters and the foundations of any agreement. But we also need to understand that when we talk about the extremism, when we talk about a country like Iran that represents through its regime an ideology of this kind, even if we are able to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Iran won't change its ideology. And there is a clear understanding of all the countries in the region, especially Muslim and Arab countries and pragmatic leaders, that Iran is not only the problem of the state of Israel, although its leaders talks about the annihilation of Israel and the denial of the Holocaust. They know it's somebody the people who know it closely, who have radical domestic elements, that they're coping with the extremists with country like Iran that tries to undermine their own regimes, fighting against an organization like Hamas, which is a model of the worst kind, a very problematic one, to a situation whereby an Islamic movement, a religious radical movement, a sister organization of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, has in fact risen to power. In fact, the Arab world today, and especially the radical Islamic groups, are looking to see whether for the first time there can be a situation whereby the seizing of such a group can succeed. And the success of the Hamas is not only Israel's problem. The success of Hamas is not only Abu Mazen's or the pragmatic officials. The success of the Hamas is a problematic harbinger for all the radical elements in the countries that want to take advantage of the democratic countries to take control and then instill their radical ideology and not to allow everybody else to live here in peace. And this understanding is something that I know that exists in the international leadership. I know that it exists in the moderate Islamic leadership, and the division between moderate and extremists crosses between religious, and I know it is adopted by the pragmatic Arab leaders, but the gap between the understanding and the willingness to take a stand is a very big gap, unfortunately. And therefore, we are in a situation whereby those incisive elements, whether it's the mass media or Al-Qaeda internet websites or other radical elements, they pose a threat to leaderships that do not dare to say out loud what is the threat, and are now telling the Western world what the Western world partly knows and partly prefers not to hear, that in fact we are all in the same war, in the same boat. The story of Iran is not only Israel's problem, it is the problem of the entire world. And the story of the Hezbollah in Lebanon is not only a domestic Lebanese problem, it's everybody's problem. And the story of the Hamas is not only a problem in Gaza, not only Israel's problem, it's everybody's problem. And if we are able to have this understanding or bring this insight into the international community, I would assume the willingness to take a stand, not necessarily in favor of the State of Israel, but rather for the free world and the international community, we can see it happening still. Since we are talking about a national conflict between two peoples, between the sea and the Jordan, between the State of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this is a conflict that we need to find a solution in order to serve the ultimate goal of the State of Israel, whose meaning is to have a Jewish democratic state. And I'm saying this because this is an internal decision, our own decision, and an Israeli choice that, to my mind, we have already internalized as a public. It's got nothing to do with partisan affiliation in Israel. It's got nothing to do with governments in the state of Israel. It's got nothing to do with political leaders. I think there's a very broad understanding among the Israeli public that the desire and the need to have the state of Israel as a national democratic Jewish state requires that we make territorial compromises and concessions in order to end the conflict, and we need to get to a situation where there will be two separate nation states, which everyone has their own national determination in their respective country, and this is the main committed foundation for any arrangement between us and the Palestinians. And I'm saying what is self-evident, which is not always self-evident. Every agreement must express the end of the national demands by setting up a nation state to the Palestinian people alongside the state of Israel and the Jewish state. This would be the only solution to the Palestinians, those who live in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, and those who have been kept in refugee camps for dozens of years by some kind of a thought or a dream that is politically fed, that perhaps Israel, which is a national Jewish state, would be the option, where we say we want to end the conflict, we want to provide a solution, but just as the state of Israel was a solution to the refugees that came from Europe or who came from the Arab countries, part of the existence of the state of Israel is to do it. The same would be, or that should be, the Palestinian Arab understanding, because without that we are not actually ending conflict. The second part of any solution is security. After all, we don't want to be in a situation where we set up a terrorist country alongside Israel, or a radical Islamic country, or a country which is backward because the result of an ineffective government and our militia that does whatever it wants against the neighbors of any country. We saw with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And therefore, this is something that we cannot afford, and I'm saying we cannot afford. It's not only about Israel, the entire world cannot afford this, because the goal is to try and provide the adequate solution to that national conflict. Now, the division between the moderate and the extremists is also evident in the Palestinian society. We can see Gaza controlled by a terrorist organization that has used democratic elections without paying any dues on the way, or an admission fee. By the way, this exists in all the democracies, including in Israel, whereby if you want to participate in elections, fundamentally you have to denounce terrorism and you have to accept basic values of democracy. There's no country in the world that would allow a terrorist organization to take part in the election. The only places it takes place with Hamas in the Palestinian Authority and Hezbollah in Lebanon, in other countries where there's no response. And I would like to promote also international processes in order to set universal rules for participation in elections. There are jurists here, and I think this is something that we need to as part of the European Constitution, even in Afghanistan and Iraq. But now we're just paying the price, the condition that did not exist in the Palestinian Authority before the elections. And the division is also an ideological division, namely we have the National Palestinian Movement and we also have the religious one, and also territorial division, because we find ourselves Gaza controlled by a terrorist organization, and the Western Bank, Judea and Samaria, I don't want to say controlled, but where there is a government which is illegitimate, which has taken upon itself the conditions of the quartet, including the recognition of the State of Israel and upholding previous agreements and denouncing terrorism.
This situation, on the one hand, is much more complicated, and on the other hand, it enables us to advance in the strategy that we adopted, which is the dual strategy, namely the attempt to come to agreements with the Palestinian National Movement, on which actually is based the principle of the two national states that live in peace, where the borders are going to be determined by agreement. And on the other hand, we have a movement that it's our capability to reach a situation of end of conflict is nil, because this is a group that still is not ready to say the first sentence, which is the recognition of the State of Israel, nothing more than that. And therefore, we today are negotiating with the pragmatic group out of the hope that we'll be able to reach an agreement, and we are negotiating with them, and we demand the recognition of the quartet conditions, not in order to punish anybody for using terror, but because if the Palestinian national movement will surrender to the other group, our capability to reach an agreement with them is going to diminish. Namely, the Hamas, there's no hope for the future. It's not just payment for the past. And when I say hope, it's hope to Israel as well as for the Palestinians who want to accept this principle of two states. Now, in the past, we usually found ourselves in a situation whereby either we had a Palestinian government who could actually do the changes that are needed in the field, but maybe didn't want to. Sometimes we had factors who were relevant for an agreement, but their capability to materialize the agreement was very problematic. And today we have more or less both, but in two different parts. And that's why this strategy says the following. We are going to negotiate with the national group and try to reach agreements. But parallelly, we have to introduce changes in the field. The capability of Israel to materialize the territorial concessions has to do with the fact that there will be an effective government on the other side, that it should be legitimate because it will adopt the conditions of the quartet, that it will be able to respond to terror in a way that in the other side there will be security arrangements that are recognized by Israel, and that's also part of the roadmap and also part of the security conditions, and only then will we be able to implement the agreements. In order for this to happen, parallel to the negotiation that we have with Abu Ala, some changes are supposed to take place that will strengthen the group in Judea and Samaria, subject to the security needs of Israel. They will create at least a change in the field from the economic point of view in order to create more trust in the process and the right distinction between the hope that can come out of the West Bank and Gaza and the situation in Gaza, because dealing with Gaza is a completely different thing. The distinction is not just between two theoretical groups. We're talking about a physical distinction. It's geographical distinction. The fact that I'm negotiating with Abu Ala, unfortunately, not going to change the situation in Gaza tomorrow morning. That's why the situation in Gaza has to receive other responses, just as we do for terror. And the terror responses are different. At the moment, our partner to the dialogue cannot give us this response in Gaza, this solution. But they too should know, and I know that on principle they understand all this, that any dialogue, which is an internal dialogue, with its product will be a result of something. A government that does not accept the conditions of the quartet will have an implication on our capability to advance, not because we want to punish anybody, but there will be no chance to advance. And therefore, it is very important that while we are acting on one hand, negotiating with Abu Ala and the pragmatic group, trying to improve the situation in the field from an economic point of view for the benefit of the Palestinians and also from the security point of view for the benefit of Israel and as a mutual interest of Israel and the pragmatic group, parallel to that, Israel is committed to act against terror in Gaza. That has nothing to do with the negotiation. It is in parallel. It is necessary. The fact that we are negotiating cannot give immunity to the Hamas, that the only thing that it wants is to stop the negotiation. And for that very reason, we are going to continue to negotiate, even the Hamas is trying to prevent it, and I expect from our partner on the Palestinian side to continue to go into the negotiating room, even if Israel acts against terror, just as I expect them in the processes that are taking place today between the Hamas and Fatah, that there will be no surrender to the extreme ideology of the Hamas, but they will insist on demanding the three conditions, and that too is not an Israeli invention, but this is a principle that was determined by the international community, and justly so, because the last thing we want is to create a situation of legitimacy to the Islamic extreme organization and its ideology, lack of capability to reach peace. Perhaps while there'll be a visibility of government, and we are supposed to look not just as next week, but also in the future years, and to try to see what is the right strategy, and to give a solution in a way that will preserve the legitimate rights of the Jewish people in this land of Israel, and will enable our neighbors, the Palestinians, also to create and implement their legitimate rights in a state which is not the state of Israel. Thank you.